as well.
Yes, I think this is, as an academic and as a think tanker, I don't usually do wardrobe changes during events. Feels very Taylor Swift. And I was asking Victoria if was it too hokey to change into my Arsenal jersey, and she said it took 22 years for us to win the league again. So I think
I know about my Scotland shirt. It's taken us even longer to get back to the World Cup. So, yeah, exactly. So no, it's fine. Yeah. This is the city of multiple outfit changes in LA for the Oscars. So I think you're in great shape for this.
Yes, and actually, it ties into the theme of the event because, of course, as many of you know, Arsenal is now part of the Kroenke Sport Entertainment conglomerate. So shares ownership with the Los Angeles Rams, among other sports franchises. And it goes to some of the themes I want to raise with Consul General Rennie. Thanks again for being with us, in terms of the role that the football plays in England's engagement, Britain's engagement, I should say, the UK's engagement with the rest of the world, but also the role that LA's playing in that. It's just very interesting that when Arsenal play their crosstown rivals, Chelsea, it's sort of like the Rams playing against the LA Dodgers in a third sport in terms of this web of sort of ownership interest. But before we get into all of that, I do want to just, again, have a shout out to our partners who did that documentary. I mean, watching it again, I'm struck by how, that's a love letter to Los Angeles in addition to the footballing aspect. It just really covers the diversity of subcultures in the footballing community, but again, it would be hard to do that in any other city in the country, just in terms of the wonderful array of these cultures. And I'm so glad Julie Ehrman participated in that. The last Great Game Lab event we had in this space early in the year, we partnered with the Irish consulate for that, and maybe some of you were here, and we were talking about the growing equity in Olympic sports across genders. And one of the themes that we look at with the Great Game Lab and in my book, and one of the things that strikes me is the story of America, the United States, kind of ending its estrangement and its distancing from this global sport is really a story of the protagonism of immigrant communities, and the film depicted that in connecting us to the sport, but also of the women's game. And that's just a wonderful story of unintended consequences where Title IX passes in the early 70s, and suddenly you have this incredible uptick of girls and women in the US playing a sport that elsewhere in the world was sort of thought of as the male incumbent football. But of course, we already had a separate male incumbent macho football, so there wasn't the kind of cultural resistance to women taking up the game. So I often feel like immigrants brought the game to the US, helped spread it, but it's women and the phenomenon of that women's national team in the 90s and what was happening in collegiate soccer that kind of naturalized the sport America, and it kind of took the foreign edge off. So I'm really glad some of that was captured on the film too. And then I think there's another thing that's always, somebody who lived here in LA for 3 years a while back, and just being in awe of the role that LA plays in this story of how America's connecting to the rest of the world through soccer. I feel like there is a unique role LA plays in synthesizing and bridging the sort of Latin American global football ecosystem with the European one. And those two subcultures have always been visible in LA. I remember back 20 years ago, I would go to Galaxy games and you'd see these two kind of worlds converging. And there was a reference to Cienfuegos, the first El Salvadoran star with Galaxy. But of course, Galaxy is also the team of Beckham. And I would see people at Galaxy matches that I might not see mixing up in other parts of LA. And it's also, sitting here with a representative of the British government, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive subcultures, because I'm originally from Mexico, and who brought global football soccer to Mexico but British minors? I mean, one of the first clubs that's still in the professional league in Mexico is Pachuca, and in the state of Hidalgo, and it was founded in the 1890s by British expats who were mining and building railroads, and that's kind of the story of how the sport spread globally in Argentina, Brazil. So that brings me to our conversation. Thanks again. And I mean, I think I just want to start with a general, I'm a big fan of the sport, and I've managed to create this thing where I pulled it into more and more my day job as an academic and journalist. Also, I brought my British socks.
Oh, excellent! Yes, I've seen these now. Yes.
Trying to ingratiate myself. But you are a serious diplomat, and how do you think, and how should we think about the role that sports plays in the various serious diplomacy that you and other members of the diplomatic corps and nations conduct? Like, is sport a serious part of your diplomatic mission?
No, it is actually, and I mean, thank you obviously for having us. It's great seeing that article as well. The kind of documentary is sort of a lot of great memories and a lot of lovely kind of pastiches of LA. It's interesting about sport diplomacy because it is an enormously valuable part of what we do. It's a very recognised part of what we do as well. I mean, especially in Los Angeles now, not just with the World Cup coming up, but the Olympics and Paralympic Games in a couple of years as well. There's a tremendous recognition about how that carries your brand around the world. And the fact that you're sitting there in an Arsenal shirt, with Visit Rwanda on the side, is saying a lot about how it goes. And I mean, people may not appreciate this. The Premier League is the most watched sports league in the world. So something like 1.2 billion people interact with the Premier League every week. And that is an enormous audience that's tuning in to watch a British sports event, specifically it's English Premier League they're watching, based in the UK with British city names. They're watching Liverpool, they're watching Manchester, they're watching Chelsea. People who watch these games become tourists to visit our country. They're wearing football shirts. And yet one of the most incredible statistics is that in the 30 years the Premier League has been running, it has never been won by an English manager. Now, could you imagine if in the last 30 Super Bowls, not a single coach was American of a winning Super Bowl team? And so I think that sports diplomacy moment of the UK, of what it represents, of how it brings people together, is truly striking. And so for us, how we kind of take advantage of that is very important. But I should say it is also incredibly unpredictable. Mm-hmm. So, most of the diplomacy you think about as being a very deliberate activity. You're going out there to generate peace and protect the world, etc., etc. But sport's mercurial. So I had no idea whether Arsenal would make it to the finals. We got beaten by the French, which is a disaster, of course. But it's kind of, we didn't know that. Likewise, Scotland, so my home country, was in the European Championships 2 years ago in Germany. And one of the elements that went viral was two Scotland fans helping an elderly German gentleman across the road in the rain by holding their umbrella over him as he crossed the road. And it was picked up by the TV, picked up by the photographers, and it went viral in Germany. Like all over Germany, this kind of meme of people helping each other, the Scotland fans helping this elderly gentleman cross the road, was all over their metro system as a kind of be kind to each other meme. I had no idea that was going to happen. And yet suddenly that is all over the news, all over the place in Germany, went global in many respects. But on the flip side, again, English Premier League was not always what it is today. In the 1980s, English football clubs were banned from Europe for 5 years because of soccer violence that they were committing on the continent in Europe. So again, the challenge of sports diplomacy is you never quite, a bit like owning a major league club. It's like, it's great when your players are towing the party line. One of them says something negative and you're out the door. So massive impact, very hard to predict.
Yeah, and also, LA, we're sitting in LA, which is going to be one of the more important, I forget how many matches, but the U.S. is opening here, 7, host cities of this World Cup. And of course, LA is the sort of America's Olympic city par excellence, coming up with our 3rd Olympic Games in LA. And you had the very successful, at least looking at it from the outside, Olympics in London in 2012 with James Bond and the Queen coming out of the chopper and stuff. Was there a lasting legacy impact from the LA Olympics in 2012 and perhaps lessons from that you could offer LA?
Yeah, and to immediately pick up on that, it's LA's 3rd time hosting the Olympics and its 1st time hosting the Paralympic Games. And that's incredibly important because the Paralympics have become a bit of the forgotten games in America. And that's an issue. If you believe in inclusion in sport and accessibility to sport, we're not talking about the Paralympics enough. And again, the Paralympic movement began in the UK back in the 1940s after World War II. And it's now synchronized with the Olympics as part of the Games, which is why in 1984 LA didn't host the Paralympic Games. And so when you think about the 2012 impact in London, for us, the Olympics themselves were a huge moment for building, like the entire East End of London was regenerated, but through that kind of money, through that support. But the Paralympics, in a way, were the biggest legacy that came out of it. Because for the first time ever, every single ticket to a Paralympic event was sold at the London Paralympics, which was enormous. And when you talk to Lord Sebastian Coe, who is the organiser of the London Games, he will say that the biggest legacy the Paralympics left behind was 40,000 more accessible hotel rooms. So as the city as a whole began to gear up for how do you create an inclusive and accommodating environment for Paralympic athletes, that is what they had to reckon with. Now, I think it's interesting for LA on this journey because I challenge Angelenos. You're sitting on the Paralympics, and this is a city that can broadcast global culture and change global minds like no other city on planet Earth. So if I were to challenge people in LA is, what do you want your legacy from the Paralympic Games to be? You could change global thinking about Paralympic athletes, about the challenges they have gone through, about the successes they have. I was talking to one of your colleagues. I mean, it's striking for me that America routinely tops the medal table, but for the last 3 Paralympic Games has come third. Behind China, some distance out front. Behind the UK, some distance in second. And then is America as a Paralympic nation. And so for me, the legacy of London was really opening our eyes to the Paralympic Games. Again, it's like English soccer. It's not like we've always got these things right. We've been on a journey too. But how are we then able to look at the Paralympic movement, how we changed our vision around it? 40,000 more accessible hotel rooms is not just about people in wheelchairs. If you're an aging population and you want to attract aging tourists, they also want step-free access to things. And they want to get on kind of hotels they can get to easily and out of easily. I think that kind of Paralympic legacy is a key part of it. And it's interesting, even when we talk to the kind of friends in LA as they're putting this together about the London experience, a lot of people will be thinking, well, we're already ADA compliant. We're ADA compliant, Paul, that's fine. Which means that, every bus in LA has the ability to take a wheelchair user. So when the 5 members of the wheelchair basketball team want to get on a bus to go somewhere, they have to wait for 5 different buses? Is that what inclusion feels like? So again, it is not like these things are obvious to you, but that sport diplomacy, that sport awareness, and how we use sport as a vehicle, not just for diplomacy, but for cultural change, for cultural awareness, I think is a hugely important part of what LA will go on. And this is the city that can deliver like no other for a global audience. So the ball is really much in LA's court, I think.
That's fascinating. Thank you. You mentioned going back to the reach of the Premier League. You mentioned it's the most followed league on the planet, and it is astonishing. I think I saw that every nation on earth the Premier League has a TV rights deal with, I think the only exceptions are North Korea, Cuba, and Russia is sort of sidelined for the moment.
And every Premier League club will have a player in the World Cup.
Yeah. And yet, so you're the home to the most followed league, and you're also, as I mentioned earlier, the inventor of the modern game, and so even in countries that you don't necessarily associate it with sort of the English culture, like Mexico and across Latin America, we sort of owe a debt of gratitude to Britain for having this sport, and yet it's kind of funny, like. I think for many decades in the second half of the 20th century and up until recently, I think if you kind of just, in thinking about the soft power of sport, if you kind of ask people on the street to associate what's the country you think of when you think of soccer, I think a lot of people would have said Brazil.
Yeah. I would too.
Yeah.
And I lived there.
For many years. Oh, you did? Yeah. And to me it's fast. But then you go to the national, I did an event on the eve of the NFL's first game in Brazil, which is another chapter in the book that 10 of you are going to read. And walking through the National Football Museum in Sao Paulo, there's also a great one in Manchester in England, but the Sao Paulo one's great. And of course, the first room is about Charles Miller, the sort of, I think he might have been Scottish, son of a railroad engineer who brought the first soccer ball to Brazil in like the 1890s, which wasn't that long ago in the big scheme of things, and launched the sport that, decades later with Pele and everything, people just around the world associate with Brazil. I feel like the rise of the Premier League is maybe reclaiming for Britain this sort of people associating, oh yes, this sport is British. Because one of the paradoxes is you all invented the game, gave it to the world, and you haven't done very well in World Cups.
Scotland's exactly. Well, I mean, the first ever international soccer match was Scotland versus England.
Right.
In like 1890.
Right. And England's only won one World Cup.
1966.
Scotland, not yet.
Yep. And so if Scotland can get out the group stages, that'd be like winning it for us.
Yeah.
But I think it's true. And it's interesting for me. I mean, we're talking with Victoria as well. How do sports kind of mirror their societal changes? So, soccer's kind of destination of being global was never foretold. I mean, there's hundreds of sports around the world that never really left their country. I mean, field hockey, the national sport of India. I mean, how many people think of field hockey? I mean, 1.4 billion people in India. It's not taking over. I mean, cricket in India is enormous. Again, another kind of British implant, but India made it its own. And it's interesting because soccer was never global. The idea of the sport going global is kind of a weird thing.
Yeah.
And it kind of required mass communication to make it work. I mean, you kind of listen to the radio broadcasts of baseball matches. And you listen to you didn't watch NBA until kind of cable TV came. NBA wasn't going anywhere as a global sport. And it's kind of true with soccer as well in the UK with the football system because people just turned up to watch the matches. Your revenue stream was the people who came through the turnstiles. That was how you made your money. You had a bigger stadium, you made more money. That was how it worked. It's why the northern clubs in England for a long time did very well, because they had very large and very loyal followings that bought tickets. And you kind of track through the kind of 60s and 70s when European football was being played, but people were not global stars. I mean, people like George Best was the closest we got to the Beckham of his day. He wasn't a global icon. He was kind of really well known in the UK, but not a global icon. And then sort of television emerged and began to take these sports around the world. And what's fascinating is how does that then open the global consciousness to things? So, I was in Malaysia as a diplomat out there. And Malaysia has two very specifically loyal tribes of Premier League fans. A massive group of Liverpool fans and a massive group of Man United fans. Really no Arsenal, no Spurs, no Chelsea. And the reason for that is that when the first televised football games came to Malaysia, it was in the 1980s and they broadcast the FA Cup, which is kind of like the Super Bowl knockout final of the UK. And Liverpool was winning everything in the 80s, so it created this whole generation of Liverpool fans. And then cable TV arrived in Malaysia just as the Premier League was getting going, and Manchester United were winning everything in the Premier League, so suddenly this next generation of fans all became Manchester United fans. And so the way that kind of Premier League has tracked the global rise of cable television, the way that American ownership has emerged, reflecting the fact that American investors put more and more money into sports as a vehicle to kind of engage one of the last sort of frontiers of genuinely watched TV. The entire Premier League is worth about $39 billion, all of it, all 20 teams right now. Dallas Cowboys by themselves are $13 billion. So even though I've got a global reach, the biggest sporting league in the world, the heartland of money remains America. And again, when it comes to the international nature of the Premier League, we're not winning things as England, but we have, multinational teams, multi-ethnic teams. It was in my lifetime, to be blunt, that black players were having monkey chants and bananas thrown on the pitch. Today, that is still a problem of racism out there, but it has been pretty much washed away by and large at the stadiums as they become more family orientated, more family friendly, and frankly, the people no longer accept that kind of racism towards people in the UK. But that was a barrier that the UK football had to go through. And so I think how I think about the journey of the soccer in the UK and the Premier League is as much how has it tracked societal change and ridden a wave of globalization. And it's interesting, you and I were talking earlier about how do then American sports replicate that? The richest leagues in the world, the biggest sponsorship packages in the world, But NFL remains very trapped within the US shoreline. I mean, amazing events they're doing in London. Very interesting to see the NFL coming to games in the UK, potentially with the franchise. NBA has internationalized and pulled back, and COVID didn't help it. NHL, baseball, they all have fits and starts.
I have to interject here that Arizona State University is also coming to the Cathedral of English football.
Wembley Stadium.
Wembley.
Yep. First ever college game to take place at Wembley.
Because the British public has been demanding that ASU play Kansas at Wembley, and so we're going to come
We
in
said,
September.
where's the home of college football? They're like, that
Yes.
ASU. We hear nothing but ASU in our journey.
So it's the first college football game to be played in Britain. I mean, they've been playing some games in Ireland, and now at Wembley. Also, it's interesting when you talk about the difference in the valuations between the Premier League and NFL teams. I mean, an American investor would say, well, if you did away with relegation in English football, those clubs, the smaller clubs, would be worth a lot more. But that's a separate.
That's exactly the challenge. I mean, I'm always struck by the difference in the US between college sports and the kind of national franchises. So you take the Raiders. The Raiders have been in LA, then they've been in Oakland, then they're back in LA, I think, and now they're off in Vegas. The idea that Manchester United is going anywhere other than Manchester is completely absurd. And one team in the UK did move, I think Wigan, from one part of London to another, and they lost their entire fan base. And so again, it's interesting for me as to how the kind of global drive, you know, that you're wearing an Arsenal football shirt, sponsored by Emirates, and Visit Rwanda. Now, Rwanda presumably thinks there's an audience more than just Londoners. Owned by Angelinos. And yet, its fan base is fiercely from Arsenal, from London. And the idea that somehow that club could no longer be British, could no longer be in London, would seem completely absurd. And so I think for me that's always the challenge in sports, to your point, is that promotion and relegation is a sacrosanct part of how the British Soccer League works. In the same way that in America, that's just not how it works. And so how you kind of can maintain that deep, deep DNA in a sport and a brand and a franchise, even as it globalizes, I think is the real question of our times. And, you know, the journey around name, image, and likeness rights for college sports is going to be a fundamental test of what does it mean to be a college sport.
What's the British government's position on NIL?
Exactly.
Yeah, and for those of you,
your problem, not ours.
For those of you who are not that familiar with sport, and maybe most of you are, but when we talk about relegation, and if you've watched Ted Lasso or Welcome to Wrexham, they kind of explain this. Unlike in our sports leagues, and this is true for most global football leagues around the world, the bottom, if you end up in the last spot, or in the case of the English Premier League, the bottom three, the next season you have to play in the lower division. And so the way to think about it is these global football domestically, so it's like a pyramid, and you have in England it's the Premier League, but then below that it's the Championship, and then League One, League Two, and the names are just make it all even more confusing. But the kind of concept is that if we all started a Herald Examiner team tonight, you know, maybe someday we could be playing in the top division. We'd get promoted, and that's what the Wrexham guys have done in Wales. And so, one thing that's fascinating is the Bill Foley, who owns the Las Vegas Golden Knights in our NHL. I think they have a big game tonight. He talked about how he was eyeing the possibility of acquiring an expansion MLS team in our domestic league. And I think the buy-in most recent franchises have been going for $500-600 million. And then he said, wait, but then he found out he could acquire Bournemouth instead, which is one of the smaller Premier League teams, for less. And this was a head scratcher to him, because, you know, he kept being told like this was the greatest league on the planet over in England. Well, why was Bournemouth, you know, $200-300 million less than that? And that's because of this system where Bournemouth is one of the smaller communities that has a team that currently is in the Premier League, but kind of baked into that price is the idea that you're going to be ejected and sent down. So there are 20 leagues every season in the Premier League. Only 6 of them have always been in the Premier League, have managed to escape that relegation. There's a lot of fluidity. And the Premier League only dates back to the early 90s when they kind of remarketed, repurposed, and relaunched the top division of English football. And in that time period, there have been something like 60 teams that have passed through it. There's a lot of up and down, which creates tremendous drama. I mean, here in our sports, if you're watching the Cleveland Browns or the New York Jets towards the end of an NFL season, there is nothing at stake other than who's going to get the highest draft pick. But there's an existential threat if you end up in one of those bottom 3 slots, because you go down and overnight your revenues kind of disappear because you lose the media rights. And so this is something that a lot of private equity investors from the U.S. and people on Wall Street have gone over there, and they're like, this is amazing. Like, how I do on the field of play has immediate financial consequences, as opposed to, I mean, ironically, we were discussing this earlier, there's a more kind of socialist orientation to our sports leagues in the U.S., which is a bit counterintuitive. But very quickly, because I do want to open it up to questions from the audience, I had 2 very quick things. You can react to whichever, weight them as you will. But just, again, on this concept that for Americans, it would be as if the rest of the world was completely obsessed with baseball. And if I was the Secretary of State, I'd want to continue to remind people that this is an American thing and ride that. And so do you all, go into Zooms with people in London about how can we continue to is the Premier League your top export, for example? And what do you do to remind people of this British tie? Or is that train just left the station and now it's just a truly global sport? And lastly, any comments, thoughts on, the sort of fact that the United States is becoming a proper footballing nation? One of the things that, the reason I wrote the book and a lot of what I do at the university is because I moved to the U.S. at the age of 15 from Mexico and was kind of shocked to discover how disconnected we were from the rest of the world and how we had developed our own sports to consciously uncouple from the rest of the world in the late 19th century, unlike in other forms of pop culture where we do tend to think of the U.S. as the center of the universe, and certainly we're sitting in Hollywood. But how does this affect, do you think, the way Americans engage with the rest of the world? The fact that, we're all tuning in to watch Arsenal on NBC, we're hosting a World Cup. You saw the amazing scenes of how popular the sport now is in LA. Are Americans sort of less weird now that we're playing your sport? So open invitation to take any of those 2, and then I want to get you all into the conversation.
Sure, I'll say a few quick things. The first thing is that we absolutely want to support the Premier League work. So week before last, we had the largest ever British trade delegation to America was in Los Angeles. And we opened that with a Premier League watch party at Consul, the kind of immersive event there. Because the Premier League is growing at like 30% viewership a year in the US. Last year was its most successful year in America, 1.2 million people watching Premier League every week in America. So it's growing incredibly quickly here. I think it's interesting as well when you watch that video that America's social demographic change is massively influencing that. The people you're talking about, a clear Latino community that's driving this engagement here in LA for many, many years. So I think as America shifts demographically, it invites more of that. I'm, in some respects, just riding the train as well. This thing is getting big, frankly, through sheer capitalism. That is what is driving the Premier League. As a government official, it's kind of like the Reagan journey of I don't want to be from the government, I don't want to help. I just want to let the thing do what it's got to do. But the last thing I'd say is what has America given us back? And what has it re-exported? And it's not just the ownership in the clubs. Things like Welcome to Wrexham, Rob McElhenney, when he went to Wrexham, he had a very deliberate vision of transforming a town. He didn't want to buy a club, he wanted to change a town. And that is what Welcome to Wrexham has done. The ability to buy a league club that's like 4 divisions below, build it up and help it rise, has given that city a sense of purpose, a sense of pride, a sense of fame that is transformational for that city. So Welcome to Wrexham has been a huge help. But the thing I think America has really missed is women's soccer. The Title IX journey you touched upon at the start, it gave birth to a global women's soccer movement. I am befuddled that you can have a 3 times winning world championship team. Winning the World Cup in England once, they're still dining out on it like 70 years later.
It was the year I was born.
Yeah, American women have won the World Cup 3 or 4 times. And no one in America knows that. For a country that prides itself on being the best in the world, nobody knows that. And that ability to have generated such an incredible sort of head start in women's soccer. And then, to be honest, we in the UK and Europe are re-importing the impact of women's soccer. The Premier League clubs are now standing up teams across the board, which I think not every MLS team is allowed to stand up a women's club. It's part of the kind of rules of how it works. The first purpose-built women's soccer stadium in the UK is coming from, I think, Bournemouth, not one of the top clubs. Brighton. And we are re-importing that to the UK. So again, America's gift back to us has not just been its engagement, but the women's sport part, I think, has been madly missed. And of course, the other very important gift to us has been Ted Lasso, because finally I don't have to explain all the rules to football when I meet Americans. I'm like, oh, is that like in that Ted Lasso episode? I'm like, it's just like that Ted Lasso episode. So thank you, Apple TV, for making Ted Lasso possible, and the World Cup make a lot more sense to all my friends in LA.
Thank you. Well, I want to invite questions from you all. We have some time, and yes, in the back. And maybe you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Corey Mitchell. I love what you said about the Paralympics, and I want to share an inspiration. Some years back, I worked for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Picture Syrian refugees living in absolute cold, in tents, in cities, with thousands of people living in some huge tented city, and you've got Paralympic kids competing on an international level, living in those conditions and competing on an international level. The disability alone is enough to inspire you, but when you see people who are living displaced in refugee camps with absolute cold and terrible conditions and food, and yet they still competed on an international level. So bravo for, your inspiration around.
Well, but if I throw it back at you, there's one place on planet Earth can take that story to the world, and it is this town. And so that is my challenge to people in LA, is like, you have the capability to take the story you just shared with me to a global, Ted Lasso and all that kind of stuff, amazing, but how will LA choose to tell the story of its first ever Paralympic Games and all the incredible stories that go with it? I mean, London was amazing. We don't have the firepower to take something like that global. Within 10 miles of here are probably 50 people who make a decision tomorrow, and it's on 165 countries licensing deals the next day, and that's unique. That is a unique thing about LA, and I think you should be very proud about what that means, but also a lot of responsibility. If I'm an outsider saying to Angelinos, you can make that decision tomorrow to tell that story to a world.
Thank you.
So, thank you. There, and then this gentleman over there.
I can't really see. Hi, I'm Krista Seitz. Thank you, Consul General. Thank you, Andrés. I am a women's soccer player myself. I play on a ton of leagues here, and I've seen that there has been a sharp decrease in participation of women's soccer players. For instance, last season we had 12 teams, went down to 8 recently. And I was wondering, how can we ensure that the FIFA World Cup, that LA 28, that there's equity and that there's incentivization for young girls and women to continue to play these sports and build community and meet others. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts, if you had any ideas.
Why do you think it's gone down? I mean, in the UK it is growing gangbusters, and it's kind of amazing to hear it's actually, you feel it's not happening in LA.
So I do see it as a whole general picture it growing, but I think because of the ICE and immigration raids, a lot of the communities I play with, they're from Central America. And so they had action plans to ensure, in case ICE came to the fields, the exit plan, but that really deterred a lot of people from even coming out again. Yeah. And perhaps other issues of gas prices, affordability to play in the league and things like that. Yeah, so it's interesting for me because we have a family connection. My wife's niece, I guess my niece as well, my wife's niece, she plays professional soccer for ADO Den Haag, a team in the Netherlands. My wife is Dutch. And so she's got a professional sports contract, which is wild. Like, when we were watching her kicking the ball with her friends, 16 years ago, you couldn't have imagined that a pro soccer contract in the Netherlands for women would be possible. I think for me it's an interesting journey that the Premier League is going through as to how much they are supporting financially the growth of women's soccer in the UK. And in the same way that, NFL sport or college football or college basketball supports a lot of other sports at colleges, like fencing programs or badminton programs,
I think there's actually quite a smart play for the Premier League to keep supporting the development of these women's sports, because frankly, the more daughters that grow up playing soccer, the more likely they are not just to kind of go watch the women's soccer play, but they'll watch the men's soccer play as well. And if they're kind of watching women Arsenal team do well, they're buying Arsenal merchandise, which will have Visit Rwanda and Emirates on it, because all the sponsorship packages tend to be jointly for the women's and the men's teams. And so for me, it's kind of a no-brainer that the clubs that are already wealthy should be spending time and energy and resource to support the development of the women's club, because that is ultimately 50% of your market. I mean, I find it befuddling that people don't think about this through a purely commercial lens, even if nothing else mattered in the world about equity and kind of doing good by people, is that the bigger you can grow your market, the better. And it's fascinating the Indian Premier League in cricket has cottoned onto this, because almost 50% of their fans are female. And so they have women's brands involved in sponsorship. I mean, the day we are seeing, Formula One teams as well, starting to have more women's products are being advertised on the sides of Formula One cars. So I think people are waking up to the need to engage women in sport more effectively. Soccer is one of the very few sports that has a ready-made kind of set of competitors. Formula One has no women drivers. The Indian Premier League has no women's cricket teams. But the soccer teams have these to go right now. And so for me, it's interesting your point that there's a specific journey that affects the growth of the system here in the US. But I think from my perspective in the UK, it's just, you've got to keep investing in it, and you invest for a return tomorrow, even if it were not the right thing to do already.
I think it's also, I would just add, interesting that even the NFL is realizing the long term, you have pretty severe constraints if you're selling a sport that half the planet can't participate in. I mean, they do as fans. But one of the things that was striking when I went to the first NFL game in Sao Paulo 2 seasons ago, when they do these international weeks, and maybe some of you have been, it's almost like a Super Bowl week where they have all of these activities around the game. And I don't know, maybe this shouldn't have been a surprise to me, but I was struck by the extent to which what the NFL itself was promoting in Brazil was flag football, and they had like workshops with coaches and the mascots and the fight songs for the Philadelphia Eagles in Sao Paulo, and it was very much seen, and it was very much promoting co-ed touch football. And even when I talk to friends in Mexico, in school, a lot of girls are playing tochito, as they call it, because, and this is sort of, again, fascinating for us sitting in the United States, even in a lot of these Mexican schools, tochito, flag football, is seen as more of a female sport than soccer because of all of the cultural associations. I mean, women's soccer has grown tremendously in Mexico, and it is kind of a re-export from the U.S. But there's still, in some people's minds, this idea that's really the guy sport. And so the enthusiasm with girls are picking up flag football. So even the NFL is trying to broaden its lens there. We had a question. The green gentleman in the green shirt, yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Rabi Ghulam, ASU grad, and I'll take a thank you first, Andrés and Paul, for spending time with us. I'd like to take credit. I'm a 96 grad, but I started the ASU soccer club in 1992. Excellent. I was the president and founder, and we had a team. We traveled the country.
Why did you start it?
I was a soccer player in high school, and at the time there were very few Division I soccer programs. And so a bunch of guys in the fraternity and in the dorm were soccer players. So we started a soccer club. We had tryouts. We had a great coach. And so anyway, it never led to a D1 men's soccer team, but ASU has a Division I women's soccer team that's quite good. So anyhow, I have a lot of questions. I'm going to start with one. Do you think that that soccer in the United States, do you think that LA is the soccer capital of the United States? And I do, and if so, the documentary was fantastic, really well done, but I think that they, in my opinion, they didn't hit hard enough on the fact that the Latino community is the heart and soul of soccer in Los Angeles for sure. And I think around the country, I would imagine that the teams in Texas and the teams in Florida and the Latin-speaking, Spanish-speaking countries are the sort of foundation of American soccer. Is that accurate, or it's probably a yes or no question?
Well, so I've lived in DC, I've lived in New York, I've lived in LA. Without question, LA is the most soccer-orientated of those cities. I think it's instructive that this is where Beckham came. Sport and celebrity go hand in hand in LA, and that's also a big part of the journey. But then the fact that Beckham invested in Inter Miami with Lionel Messi, I think it is tracking that the kind of Latino community is helping to create that sense of what does soccer mean to them, because it requires a passion. This it's the easiest game in the world. We used to joke, so we play rugby a lot as well in the UK, in Scotland particularly, and there was always a joke that kind of rugby is a hooligan's game played by gentlemen, and soccer is a gentleman's game played by hooligans. And so the kind of easy thing in the world is to start a game of football, a couple of jumpers, you can just go at it. But that comes from a community passion. And, I lived in Brazil. The street games in Brazil were just everywhere. And the joke was always you could go down to Copacabana Beach in Brazil and just find 11 kids playing football that would win the World Cup. And it's probably, frankly, still true today. But I think it is that culture that has come from South America, from Argentina, from Brazil, from Mexico, that has kind of created that essence of why do we care? Yeah. And yet, the women's soccer journey has not been built by that. The women's soccer journey was like literally a cash money injection through Title IX, a huge pipeline of young, mainly white, I think, high school girls coming through, doing a sport other than whatever is traditional to do as a sport, going to high school programs. And so for me, it's fascinating with America that there are two very different soccer journeys in the way that the UK has been a kind of sort of male-led learning from America to catch up with women. I think in a kind of weird Darwinian sense, women's soccer and men's soccer have almost evolved in two completely different planets. And I don't know, you know more better than I, Andrés.
Well, no, I think that's well said. I do love the fact that the people get very competitive about, proclaiming themselves the soccer capital. And again, from my vantage point of having arrived here at the age of 15 when hardly anyone in the States cared about soccer. I love that now we have cities fighting for this. So one of my chapters in my book was I sort of flesh out a lot of these themes in Kansas City, which in many ways is also a fascinating host city for this World Cup for many reasons. And they are very proud to call themselves the soccer capital of the U.S. And they have very strong claims, and so does Dallas, and certainly LA, especially when we're talking about some of the transatlantic themes that came up earlier, and the fact that we're also Mexico's second city, and so on. And as a Mexican, I would love to give all credit to Mexico and to Latin America, but to be fair, one of the things that's been fascinating about this project across our 5 host cities. One of our documentaries, if you go to Great Game Lab at ASU, our website, you can see the 5 different projects. We did a similar documentary about Philadelphia and how Philadelphia got connected to the World's Game. And, the common thread, yes, is immigrant communities bringing the game to the fore. But in Philadelphia, it's an amazing story of Ukrainian ethnic clubs that in the 50s and 60s, and also Croatians, but Ukrainian immigrants, and our fellow, our documentarian who did that project spent a lot of time interviewing the sort of multi-generational Ukrainian. So it's a wonderful story, and it varies in its particulars in each city. One of the, early on in this documentary, Kevin at the LA Times was talking about some of the history of different immigrant communities, even in LA, right? Los Angeles Maccabees early on. And if you search online and look at the winning roster, the clubs that have won the U.S. Open Cup, which is the sort of, literally it's an open tournament. It's kind of like the FA Cup in England that's been around for more than a century. And it's an amazing kind of tribute to the mosaic of immigrant communities that have helped build soccer in the U.S. And LA Maccabi won that, back in the 30s or something. You'll see this Philadelphia Ukrainians won 4 titles in the 60s. You'll see teams like New York Hungarian or like the New York Hungarian Germans. And of course, in recent 20 years, it's all been MLS clubs. But back in the day, it was these immigrant teams, and it's so it is wonderful. But yes, I mean, just given the fact that we're sitting in the U.S.-Mexico soccer relationship as a whole, we could have a whole different event on that, and just the fact that we're sitting in the part of the U.S. and I live in Arizona, that where you have this overlap of our two cultures. We're huge rivals now, but we also vie for the same talent. And so yes, in so many U.S. cities, it has been a story of people from Mexico.
And I think for me it's interesting because you're about to have the kind of classic doubleheader, World Cup and then the Olympics, which is what you had in 1994 and 1996. So it'll be very interesting, I think, whenever the dust has settled on this, somebody probably like you, Andrés, will go back and kind of want to track what changed from 94 to 26 and from 96 to 28. Like what? Because in the same way that I talked about how soccer has changed as the UK has changed as a society, how Indian Cricket League has changed as India's changed society, what will America see different in that kind of 30-year gap between these two global sports coming to America and what it meant, what it kind of did for the country?
Well, one more question, and then we can continue talking amongst ourselves. I want to talk to Paul for 5 more hours, but he probably has better things to do, and
I've got a book to read, apparently.
Thanks. My name is Yesenia Vargas, LAFC fan, Bundesliga fan. My curiosity here, my background is also in public diplomacy. This is the first time we have 3 host countries.
Yep.
And I mean, the next one will have, I believe, 5 or 6. But this is the first time we have 3. And normally, a host country, you're putting yourself out there. You can reap soft power. You're putting yourself on display. You're also opening yourself up to criticism. How do you see soft power playing out with 3 hosts? Do you essentially, all you have to do is be better than one of the hosts in order to reap the benefits, which we're seeing now with, say, Mexico hosting the Iranian team that the U.S. refused to. Initial reports coming out that, South Africa can't travel to Mexico, they haven't received their visas. Turns out that's wrong. They have, but one of them hasn't received their U.S. visa. And so you have these comparisons among the 3 hosts.
Yeah, I mean, this is the journey. I mean, we go back to the last LA Olympics. Russia boycotted it because the Americans had boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. So sports diplomacy swings both ways. It's both an opportunity to shine. It's also a chance to express your outrage and opinion and irritation. And I think for me, it is interesting how every moment with a traveling fan is a moment to kind of bring a life to that country. So we work with Visit Britain, who's one of our kind of big kind of UK tourism agencies. One of the best statistics they have is that anyone who has visited a country is 17% more likely to invest in that country. So right now, you will have tens, hundreds of thousands of soccer fans traveling to America in individual cities. Each one of them is a potential future investor, not just an immediate tourist dollar right now. And how they feel, how they are received, will change their opinions. I mean, without question, there are people who may decide they don't want to travel to certain countries because they may not feel safe. They may feel the crime is too high, or they don't like the kind of look of the place, or it's too expensive. But others will travel who'd never thought to go to some of these cities just because their home team is there. And so I think if you're looking at it from a kind of opportunity perspective, it's a chance to shine. And, the thing that I've learned the most in 25 years of diplomacy is that people are just people. In the same way that most of Americans don't wake up in the morning plotting the demise of their enemies, most people out there don't wake up in the morning plotting America's demise either. They're just trying to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads and get their kids through school. And I think what you will find with soccer is that all these traveling teams that will come will be coming with their national flags and their kind of national engagement, but they're going to just be people as well, and they'll be hanging out at the taco stands and the bodegos of New York and just chatting to folks about, I love football and you love football too, we connect. And it's tough to say this as a diplomat, but sometimes governments get in the way of people just connecting as people. And I think that sense of watching 2 rivals be able to fight it out on the field to the death As a football game, a kind of, as one of the great English managers once said, football's not a matter of life and death. It's much more important than that. And yet, at the end, finish the match and have a beer together, or have a chat together, have an engagement together. It gives me a sense of what really diplomacy is all about. And it's not lost on me that, this is America's 250th anniversary. 250 years ago, my ancestors and many of your ancestors were in a shooting war. George Washington killed 8,500 British service personnel. And yet, look at us today. Two of the closest partnerships in the world, the UK and the US. So I kind of feel that the politics is inescapable, because that's how people see it from the big lens. But I think when the people hit the ground and they hit the partnerships and they hit the games, they will just be coming together because they are thrilled to be there and will be engaged as people to people. And for me, that is the foundation on which all diplomacy is built. And if people like me can kind of make the best of that and get out of the way for the worst of it, the world will be a much happier place.
Yeah, and I would just add, I do think it's interesting that, as you mentioned, it's unprecedented for the three countries to share the hosting rights. One of the things I always talk to my students about is, what is the story that a host of an Olympic Games or a World Cup is trying to tell the world about itself? These are, you alluded to this in the case of Britain, these are unprecedented opportunities to tell a story about yourself. And one of the things that's been interesting is how much things between our three North American neighbors have changed in between the time that the initial bid was submitted and today. Because I think this was an opportunity, it was seen as an opportunity, in 2016, 2017, as the bid was being put together, to showcase how close, ever closer the three North American neighbors had become. I mean, I used to be in a DC think tank, and we used to talk with some exuberance about North American integration. That I word now is a big no-no. It's become more taboo, not just in the U.S., but in Mexico and in Canada as well. And but that initial bid it was labeled as a united bid, and it was meant to say, this is an unprecedented level of symbiotic cooperation between these three. It was still a bit of a stretch to say, okay, what is this community of three nations that is hosting this thing? There is a precedent of a FIFA World Cup shared across two countries.
Japan and Korea.
Korea and Japan. That was very different. That was almost like a shotgun partnership where FIFA was still kind of reluctant to upsetting the rhythm of World Cups alternating between Latin America and Europe. And they said, if we're going to take one out of that and share it with Asia, you guys get to share it, because who knows when we're going to come back to Asia. And it felt Korea, Japan was like two different countries having two different World Cups that at a certain point in the calendar, they joined together, but there was very little effort to present this united front of we are one community, one host. And I feel like that's kind of where we've ended up with this one, where the World Cup is happening in Canada, it's happening in Mexico, it's happening in the United States, but there's very little effort in terms of the messaging. Now, you're right, when it comes to the people's experience, that's very different. But as in terms of political messaging, that opportunity to showcase how much closer we've all become has been lost because things have changed politically, and it's, this is coming at the 250th anniversary of the United States, as you mentioned. It's also coinciding with the deadline to renegotiate our trade agreement between the three host nations, and that's very much up in the air. So it's just endlessly fascinating how sport, because of all the passions associated with it, does spill over and has political consequences, because it matters so much to so many people. And again, I would love to talk to you for hours about this stuff, but I want to be respectful of you all's time. You've been very patient. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the Pacific Council for doing this with us. Great collaboration, and for inviting all your members. We can stick around for a little bit longer. I think we don't get kicked out of here till like 2 in the morning. No, probably a little bit before then, but have another drink and let's keep talking amongst ourselves. Thank you so much. Thank you.